Hello everyone, Assalamu alaikum. We're going to get started with the next session. We started with Amira's legacy as a founder, and now we're going to her legacy as a scholar. When I looked at the schedule for today, it only gave 45 minutes to the academics, which Amira would protest. So I'm going to give us a bit more time so that we can properly reflect on her scholarly contributions. I wanted to start just with a personal anecdote, actually. My first memory of Amira was actually when I came to give my job talk at Georgetown. And I remember my palms were sweaty, I was standing outside of the room, and she could see that I was nervous. And she came and she stood next to me and she said, "You have the job." And I said, "I haven't even given my job talk yet." And she goes, "Yes, but you have the job. And go in like you have the job." And that was Amira. She was confident, and she wanted you to have that confidence. And all of my interactions after that with Amira really can be summed up in that moment. There's two that I think are particularly important to tell. One was after I was hired, she came to me and she said, "I want you to put in appeal for your salary." And I said, "Why am I going to put in an appeal for my salary, Amira? It's been 6 months. That's quite a big fight to take on with the administration." And she was faculty chair at the time, and she said that there was a discrepancy between what the female members of faculty were being paid and what the male members of faculty were being paid. And within 6 months, sure enough, I had almost a $15,000 raise. And that was because of Amira. And it didn't just impact me, but it impacted a lot of other female faculty members. The second story, which I think is particularly important because this is tied to the 20-year celebration of Georgetown, is Amira was also the faculty chair when it was the 10-year anniversary of Georgetown. And it was a really big deal. It was a really big deal for Georgetown to be celebrating 10 years. Her Highness Sheikh Moza was going to attend. And it was a beautiful evening that was planned with a tribute from the founding dean, a conversation with the current dean, and Amira fought for there to be a faculty address. And when it came down to who was giving the faculty address, she said that she wanted me to give it. And I said to Amira, "That makes no sense. I've been at Georgetown for a year. I've just started. You are one of the founding members at Georgetown. You should be the one to give the address." And she did what Rugaya did. She goes, "Shh, you will give the address." And again, it was this moment in which, despite Amira having a lot of different types of power in the capacity she's held, as faculty chair, as one of the most senior members of the faculty, she always used that power to help others. And specifically, she used it to help women whenever she could. And I think that was something so important in her, in the way that she was as a person. And I think that's also reflected in her scholarship. It was a scholarship of passion. And when you read her work and when you engaged with her, all of that passion really came out. And so today what we have is three scholars who are here to present her impact in very, very different fields. Dr. Nelly is going to be talking about her impact in Ottoman history and Egyptian history. Dr. Asma Afsaruddin is going to be talking about her impact in Islamic studies. And Dr. Ahmad is going to be talking about her impact in Indian Ocean studies. And I think the breadth of just that range, especially for academics in the room, it is really rare. It is very rare for a scholar to be able to impact such different fields, such different time periods, and that in itself speaks to her legacy. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our three presentations. Thank you.
First of all, I have to thank Georgetown University for thinking of organizing such a seminar and bringing together so many people that know Amira in different capacities. I appreciate that very much. And thank them, of course, for having invited me. I am a very close friend and colleague of Amira. We met must have been in the very late 80s, but when I was first employed at the American University in Cairo, that was in 1991, we shared an office. And so I used to see a lot of her. And then some years later, she left Mohandesin in Cairo and moved to Zamalek. So that was about 5 minutes walk from my house, and we often visited. So I often visited her in her house. I saw Habla as she was growing up. And it became very much like almost a family affair between us. We attended conferences together. We went to Hong Kong on one of the seminars. I don't even remember the date. We organized activities in our department. And so I can talk about Amira in many, many capacities, as a friend, as a neighbor, as a colleague, as a conference organizer. I've seen her with students inside class, outside class. So I know Amira very well. However, in today's lecture, I will focus on her academic legacy, her academic contributions. But I would like to say that her publications, although they are quite numerous, books and articles and book chapters, when we talk about her contribution, we also have to take into consideration her contribution to students, with which many of you have already spoken about. We have to also take into consideration the number of student activities and seminars that she organized. All this, I think, counts towards the diffusion and of her knowledge to others. But today I'm talking about her academic publications, and I would like to say that if I would like to put all this in one concrete feature of what I think is an important contribution, I would say that what dominated her scholarship in general, regardless of the actual subject, but what dominated her scholarship was her search for new paradigms in Middle East history generally, and history of Egypt in particular. And in that channel, she was part of a school of thought among Middle East historians. I'm thinking of Professor Afaf Lutfi Sayyid of University of California, Los Angeles, to whom she dedicated her book Beyond the Exotic, and she considered Afaf to be her mentor. I'm also thinking of scholars like Peter Gran of Temple University and the author of Islamic Roots of Capitalism, who was a close friend of hers and who also was involved in this search for new paradigms. How should we write Middle East history? And she shared this objective, and she was involved in it. And I think this group of historians wanted to rethink the traditional mainstream narratives of Middle East history. This implies a very broad program. It implied freeing Middle East history from Eurocentric approaches. Amira approached this subject in many of her works, and she chose to do it through a particular optic in the majority of her works, because this is really what she spent most effort on. She chose to do it, she chose to find new paradigms in her work on gender and women. Studying the history of women in the pre-modern period or early modern period, and the history of women in the post-modern period in the 19th and 20th century, this was for her a way of understanding Middle East society. So it went beyond the idea of women and gender to a bigger picture or a bigger objective on understanding the Middle East as a whole. It was a way through which to challenge Western perspectives of the decline and the stagnation of Middle East societies, and of considering the advent of the West as an awakening or as a new beginning. In Egypt, this new beginning is set to start in 1798 with the expedition of Napoleon, or it is seen as the dividing line between two periods, before and then after, before in which culture was in decline, in which society was dormant, in which it was run by political despots, and then after the awakening, when European influence was emerging. Prior to 1800, the history of the region was perceived as being in decline. It was closer to folklore than to history. In other words, there was a static history, a history that did not develop, or a history that was incapable of changing in and of itself. It needed this outside incentive in order to be able to change. So therefore, there was a parallel for Amira between portraying society and portraying women. And her history of women and gender had its parallel in her mind with the history of the Middle East in a much more general way. For example, terms like the Arab women, the Middle Eastern women, the Muslim women had certain implications. It was a stereotype that portrayed a woman that was flat, unchanging, deficient in comparison to Western women. So I want to show how the work of Amira Sonbol addressed some of these issues and what are the channels through which she countered these Eurocentric approaches. In fact, many of her writings were in fact an effort to change this picture by creating new paradigms, by showing new ways of studying women and consequently new ways opening new ways that would open the door to a different understanding of societies as a whole, whether societies in any part of the Middle East. Her studies on gender took her on a long journey in different sources and in different periods and in different regions. As you know, she wrote a lot about Egypt, and then her interest focused on Jordan, and then she moved to the Gulf. She had a very broad approach in terms of geographical region, and she thus uncovered ways to use well-known sources in different ways and to locate sources which had not been used previously for gender history. For example, religious sources, the scriptures, the books of jurisprudence, the fatwas, which have in most studies been read as religious sources for guidance, she used them as historical sources, sources which a historian could find outlets to understand contemporary society or earlier society. Her journey in sources took her to reading the court records of Ottoman Egypt, which consisted of cases brought in front of the Qadi in the 17th and 18th century. So in addition to reading scriptures and jurisprudence, she also looked at sources that looked at implementation of religious principles or provisions. These were particularly relevant for issues related to periodization, in addition to voluminous cases like marriage contracts, for example, which she studied in detail. It also took her to the records of the mixed courts of Egypt, founded by Khedive Ismail in 1875, and this was a source which had not been previously used for gender studies. I want to refer to two particular paradigms, or two particular channels which pushed her to find a new paradigm for the understanding of history. One of them has to do with periodization. Periodization is very important for our understanding of the history of this region, especially the Levantine part of this region. As I just mentioned, Arab history basically our narrative of Arab history or Middle East history is based on European periodization and is usually based on this division of the arrival of Europeans. We see it, for example, the history of Algeria. I mean, modern Algeria starts when it is conquered by the French. Egypt's modern period starts with the time when they are conquered by the French. And so very often the periodization of this period has been situated at times of conquest and colonization. And this conquest and colonization opens the door to modernization and to improvement of society in different ways. By the emergence of liberal thought, freedom of women, etc., etc. What Amira did was to show how fallacious this idea was, and she did it in different ways. I point to two articles in particular that she wrote on this subject. One of them is The History of Marriage Contracts in Egypt, which she published in Hawa, and the other one that dates which has dated from periods earlier than 1800, and another article on the mixed courts of Egypt, in which she compared conditions 17th, 18th century to conditions at the end of the 19th century. And what did she find? Well, she found that there were marriage contracts dated from the 17th century in which the contract contained conditions set by the women or by the bride, and which showed a completely different picture from what one would expect from marriage contracts at the time. The women or the brides wrote conditions like the husband was not to take another wife, the husband was not to move her to another town, her child from another marriage would eat in his home. The husband would allow her to travel to Mecca when she wished to do so. Conditions that at the end of the 19th century were cancelled. Legal marriage contracts at the end of the 19th century, and that's according to the the registers of the mixed code that she studied, no longer had conditions. In fact, did not recognize a condition. If you had a condition, it was not recognized. These little articles are not very long, are a direct challenge to the periodization that we are used to applying to the history of the Middle East. The periodization that implies that the modern age and the European influence came with a lot of improvement for the position of women. She shows exactly the opposite, that in this particular case, I'm not generalizing, but in this particular case, we have a periodization which shows a completely different picture. It's a different story. The mixed courts, which have a very strong European element in them, without going into all the details of what they were much less favorable to wives than were the contracts that dated from, let's say, 200 or 300 years before. The development of such a paradigm with regard to women had broad consequences on the mainstream understanding of periodization, and the notion of progressive amelioration from a traditional society to a modern society was being questioned in her studies along this line. So this is the first point, which I think, is one of the paradigms that she developed in this particular domain of marriage contracts. I will point to another paradigm, and that will be my second point. It's not the only thing I can say about Amira's work, but in order to be brief and allow time for the other speakers, I want to point out to this question of the stereotype, the Middle Eastern woman and the Arab woman, which, by the way, is still very popular. The Arab woman is an indication of some lower status than the woman in general. And so I think what she was trying to do in her book, beyond beyond the exotic. It's a book with a large number of articles in different specializations, in different regions, and so on. What is important about this book is this. Amira chose to include articles from almost every region in the Middle East, from Lebanon, from Egypt, from Istanbul, from Aleppo, from Algeria, to name a few, and she chose very different periods. The people covered from early Islam, Middle Ages, later period, until the modern time. And so each one of these with a theme involve women in economic activities, women as artists, women as housewives, educated women, rural women, urban women. In other words, it was a way to answer the stereotypes that there is one standard type of women. If she's a Muslim, that she's the Muslim woman, or if she's an Arab, then the Arab woman. We're supposed to understand from such a stereotype exactly what women are. And I think the variety with which we find in this book, and the variety in time, in space, and in activities, and in specializations, was a direct attempt to break this paradigm and to show that there is so much variety and there's so much diversity in our region of the world. I mean, it's about women, but in fact, it's about our region in general. This attempt to fracture the stereotype, I think, is one of the biggest achievements in the book. These are some of the contributions. There are many more that we could talk about. I think they're important. I think if we think of her work as a groundbreaking attempt at paradigm reshuffling, we can find much more, both in the history of gender, the history of women, the history of legal institutions, and in general, and that's the most important, history of our regions, the Middle East or Egypt or wherever it is that we're talking about. Thank you very much.
I think I'm going to stand. I have a very small voice, and I think I need to project a little bit better. But let me begin by thanking Dean Safwan Masri for issuing this very kind invitation to take part in this very important symposium, and also thanks are due to his wonderful staff for facilitating everything. So I can still remember when I first met Professor Amira Sonbol in the flesh. I was a newly minted assistant professor at the University of Notre Dame, where I had started to teach in 1996, so it was in the mid-90s. And she was teaching then on the main campus of Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., and had begun to make a name for herself as a pioneering feminist historian of the Middle East. I have forgotten details about the conference itself, what topic it was on, except that it had to do vaguely with the Arab world, organized by one of my colleagues at that time, but I remember Amira very well. She was a dynamic presence, full of life and bubbling over with great ideas. For those of you who knew her even slightly, you know what I'm talking about. She made an impression on you right away. And from the first panel this morning, of course, we realized that that was true with practically everybody. I had the good fortune to be seated at her table for dinner that evening. Amira proved to be a highly engaging conversational partner and showed deep interest in my own research and future projects that I was contemplating. And I have to admit that I was touched by her interest in my own little and what appeared to me at that time rather insignificant projects, which I imagined would be of no consequence to anyone but myself. By the way, can everyone hear me? I can hear kind of a bit of an echo. Is that okay? All right. And at that time, I was editing a volume of essays. And it was my very first editorial attempt, and I was a little apprehensive of having undertaken such a project. And Amira, when she learned about it, very kindly offered to help me in kind of navigating some of the problems that I was confronting. Fortunately, I did not have to take her up on it, but I do vividly remember that very kind gesture. It was not only her exceptional collegiality and receptivity to meeting people in different venues and exchanging ideas of all sorts that made Professor Sonbol such a commanding presence in our field, but it was also, above all, the breadth and depth of her scholarship and the innovative and highly original nature of her publications, which we learned about quite a bit from Professor Hanna's presentation. As I see it, Amira's oversized influence could be felt and will continue to be felt in two major disciplinary fields which she helped develop and grow in transformative ways. We've already heard about her contributions in Islamic history, of course, but for me, two other fields need to be brought into this conversation. First is the field of Islamic law, with a focus on the rights of women. And the second is the field of women's studies within Islamic studies, which was still in a rather embryonic stage back in the 1990s. These two fields often blended together in Professor Sonbol's writings, who traversed them effortlessly and often discussed women's rights in a legal context. She also brought the seasoned historian's perspective and sharp analytical eye to her dissection of these various issues, being keenly sensitive to cultural specificities, again nicely underscored by Professor Hanna, and the necessity of socio-historical contextualization of the material we study, whether through a religious, historical, or political lens. Professor Sonbol published 9 authored and co-authored volumes and 44 journal articles and book chapters. This is, of course, a substantial oeuvre, and in my limited time, I can only do justice to a very small number of them. I will therefore pick my favorites among these publications and comment on how they challenged the boundaries of women's histories and broadened and deepened our methodological approaches to the study of women's issues in the field of Islamic studies as well as Middle Eastern studies. One of Amira's best-known publications is her single-authored 2002 monograph published by Syracuse University Press under the title Women of Jordan, Life, Work, and Law, which we already heard referenced in a couple of presentations already. This was published in the well-known series, Gender, Culture, and Politics in the Middle East. In this work, she examined the contemporary situation of Muslim women in Jordan with regard to labor laws in the country that were ostensibly derived from Islamic law, but which created severe legal constraints on women's abilities to work outside the home. Professor Sonbol undertook a thorough examination of the historical data from the Sharia court records of Asalt, Irbid, Amman, Nablus, and Jerusalem before the modernization of law in Transjordan and Palestine, and compared that with the legal data she gathered about the application of modern Jordanian labor laws that regulated women's work. As a result, one of the most striking and even startling conclusion, maybe not as startling anymore because Professor Hanna already clued us in, but one of the very important conclusions that she arrives at in the book is that, as one reviewer for the Digest of Middle East Studies phrased it, and now I'm quoting from this review, the new Sharia of the modern courts and modern law restricts women and their participation in the labor market in ways in which the medieval Sharia courts did not. And thank you, Nelly, for pointing that out already and setting the stage. In other words, women actually had more legal agency in the pre-modern world, and compared to the situation in the modern nation state, such as in Jordan, where an admixture of European legal provisions and fiqh regulations combined with the urf for local customs created a modern legal system that resulted in greater patriarchal control over women's lives. Sonbol sought to demonstrate that interpretations of the Sharia change with time and place, and that Sharia is not interchangeable with fiqh or Islamic jurisprudence. As she remarks in the book, quoting now again, it is important to show that fiqh represents a moral discourse rather than a wholly unchanging Sharia designed by God that all Muslims are expected to follow, end of quote. Although this distinction is now taken for granted in the field of Islamic legal studies, allowing for a more nuanced understanding of the relation between Sharia and fiqh. Professor Sonbol was among the very early legal historians to emphasize this critical difference and show how this affects our understanding of applied Islamic law, affects our understanding of its application in specific locales. She was able to demonstrate this more convincingly by producing documentary evidence. Again, we heard about the importance of that, which she had collected by painstakingly and meticulously sifting through court records in various parts of Jordan. Tedious though this venture may seem, it was an absolutely indispensable method to break through the abstract academic theorizing about women's legal agency, or maybe I should say about the Arab woman's legal agency, and categorically document how in real time women were able to assert their legal rights and negotiate the judicial processes for their own benefit. Professor Sonbol was in fact one of the very first feminist historians to challenge much of the received wisdom regarding women's role and status in Muslim-majority societies on the basis of legal archival evidence. The book therefore constituted a monumental accomplishment in the fields of both Islamic legal studies and women's studies, and demonstrated the potential of court records to illustrate the lived realities of women's lives and thus rewrite the history of Muslim women and their accomplishments, particularly in the pre-modern period. Much of the discussion started in the book, Women of Jordan, continued in a number of her subsequent journal articles and book chapters. Based on her path-breaking analysis of records produced in Sharia courts in different parts of the Arab world, Sonbol came to the conclusion that, and now I'm quoting from her again, if pre-modern Sharia courts illustrate anything, it is that the stereotypical image of Muslim women as secluded women living outside of the public sphere under the full control of male relatives is seriously challenged by the variety of activities that are included in litigation or contractual records, end of quote. She noted that like men, women came to court for all sorts of reasons. They sued for wages or for payment of debts for goods and services. They recorded their marriage contracts in court and sued their husbands sometimes for delayed dowry, divorce, and child custody. Hardly the image of passive, disenfranchised women who were at the mercy of their male relatives in the management of their affairs. Sonbol wields a precise academic scalpel and skillfully excises this unfortunate image and replaces it with the exact opposite. She also documents the Sharia court records produced during the Ottoman period, categorically shows that women were very active in business and crafts. And I think President Ahmad Dalal alluded to this fact in his own reading of her material. For example, Palestinian records showed that women carried out daily work in a number of venues, such as in quarries, for which they received compensation. As allowed within Islamic law, they owned property in their own names, even after marriage, and often accumulated much wealth which they used to endow and control the waqfs, or the endowments, of charitable and public institutions. Some women acted as multazims, or tax farmers. Some headed women's guilds that represented the crafts in which women worked in large numbers. There are references to women who served as heads of guilds of physicians and weavers and entertainers. It is impossible to argue with hard documentary evidence of this sort, and it is precisely this kind of pioneering work that led Professor Sonbol to remark perceptively and a little acidly, quoting, "It is not a question of God's laws that cannot be changed. Rather, it is a patriarchal state that refuses to change laws controlling gender and family. The pretext that this is in fulfillment of God's wishes being an excuse that is put into question once the specificities of women's history and the history of legal practices are brought to light, end of quote. This was Sonbol, the consummate historian at work, who was driven by this valuable evidence that she had uncovered to challenge and revise many unexamined preconceptions of women's social and legal agency in the Middle East. Her recourse to court documents furthermore allowed her to transcend and challenge many of the dusty old bromides that have been generated in the Western Academy about the nature of Islamic law. One of the worst offenders in this regard has been Max Weber, who in his typical 19th century Orientalist vein tended to trivialize Islamic law and its assumed arbitrary nature, since only Protestant Europeans, he alleged, with their uniquely rationalist work ethic produced in a capitalist ethos, was capable of generating a real legal order. We may today dismiss such sentiments and essentialist pronouncements as having been largely superseded by better, more careful scholarship, but as Sonbol demonstrates, vestiges of such views still color how Muslim majority societies are studied by certain social scientists and how Islamic law is still talked about in the Western, or at least in parts of the Western Academy. Amira played an outsized role in strenuously challenging these perspectives, thanks to her innovative and methodological rigor and her skill in reading original archival sources not previously consulted and decipher them in a way that is not burdened by prior ideological presumptions. I am very proud and grateful that one of Amira's last publications was the chapter she wrote for my 2023 edited volume, The Oxford Handbook of Islam and Women. And sorry for this unintentional plug, but it does fit here. And I want to point out that actually Professor Siddiqui also contributed to this handbook. In her chapter, Professor Sonbol focused on the topic of Muslim women's participation in the economies of their communities during the Mamluk period in Cairo, and unearthed a wealth of information regarding their contributions from primary sources. The sources that she relied upon for this research are multiple and varied. Records of financial transactions concerning trade, mortgage, and litigation of various kinds, documents of financial settlements during marriage and divorce, inheritance records, records of charitable endowments, and trusts established by women. Sonbol's survey of these documents revealed that some women were economically very engaged and made critical contributions to their local economies that were recognized as important and essential in their own time. Their economic productivity enjoyed legitimacy because women, along with men, as I mentioned already, are given the right to own property under Islamic law, and as she phrased it, neither was forbidden from being financially active, investing, holding, or spending wealth, inherited or earned. In the life of the community, Sonbol describes a socioeconomic relationship between male and female as rhizomatic, that is to say, interconnected, horizontally, characterized by communality and mutual dependence, rather than a vertical hierarchical relationship. A very important observation. By citing real cases drawn from these myriad documents, she brought to life the impressive range of economic activities that Muslim women engaged in, continuing a tradition that extends back to the early formative period of Islam and even to the pre-Islamic period. Based on her meticulous studies, Sonbol observes that the diversity of financial transactions that women were involved in, as registered in pre-modern courts, shows how integral women were to the economies of their communities and families, and that such economic participation was even considered normative. This is a brilliant and novel assessment of Muslim women's contributions to their local economies during the Mamluk period, and very nicely complements her findings regarding women's work during the Ottoman period as well. In conclusion then, the fields of women's history and gender studies in the Middle East has suffered a huge blow with the passing of Professor Amira Sonbol, our beloved friend and colleague. She was an eminence grise in our field, possessed of a towering intellect and a big heart, as we know now, whose exceptional pioneering scholarship will continue to impact the Academy for a very long time. I consider myself extremely fortunate in having gotten to know her and her work as well as I did, and that our lives touched at so many points, enriching my own work and perspectives. So rest in peace, dear Amira, and thank you for being such a trailblazer and an incredibly inspiring role model. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'd like to begin by thanking Georgetown for bringing us all together to celebrate the work of a groundbreaking scholar, a friend, and a colleague. I first met Amira in 2009 when I joined Qatar University. At that time, she was the chair of the International Relations Department. And I would like to echo what was said earlier, that under her leadership, the department became one of the most dynamic programs in Qatar University, and it became one of the most popular majors among the undergraduate students. So today, actually, I'm going to talk about or focus on a theme that became a passion for Amira during the past few years, and that is her interest in Indian Ocean studies. It was during my second term at Qatar University between 2013 and 2015 that we became engaged in Indian Ocean studies here at Georgetown, and she was very instrumental in creating the group, which included Rughaya, Uday, Sandra Green, Phoebe, and many others. So I remember that our first meeting was in September 15, 2015. And that marked the beginning of a very vibrant activities, including book readings, meetings, seminars, and so on, which all culminated in the Indian Ocean Symposium, which was organized in April 2017. So that it became, but her seminal work is a chapter titled Gender and Geography in the Land of Punt, which was published in a co-edited volume by Rughaya Busharaf and Dale Eckerman, a book titled Africa and the Gulf Region. So in that chapter, Amira put together a wide range of stories, including Queen Hatshepsut of Egypt, her voyages to the land of Punt, meaning, if you could put the first slide, please. The land of Punt refers to the region of the north, the Horn of Africa. Somalia, Ethiopia, Eritrea, they also. So in that chapter, she put together these voyages, which, or these stories ranging from Queen Hatshepsut voyages to the region, as well as the first Muslim hijrah to Ethiopia, when the early Muslims were protected by the king of Abyssinia at that time. And she argued, she used these stories to illustrate that the interaction between Arabia and the Horn of Africa. And she argued that the Red Sea, actually, just like the Mediterranean, served as not as a divider, but as a unifier between these two regions. And the chapter also offered a gender reading of the land of Punt, exploring how gender relations affect and were affected by the movement of people, goods, and so forth. So in this spirit, my presentation today focused on a much more contemporary period, looking at mobility and the movement of people between Northeast Africa and Arabia. And I would like to illustrate, mainly I'm looking at labor migration and so forth. But I want to illustrate 2 points. One is to show that how the production of certain commodities had affected labor relations as well as social relations in the region. And also want to emphasize the way in which labor recruitment by the British was shaped by issues of race, citizenship, and politics. So I stumbled upon this document from the British archives in early February of 1949, about 20 Somali men arrived at the palace of Sheikh Abdullah bin Jassim, the ruler of Qatar, and they presented their case saying that they were riding a boat from Aden to Muscat, and as they approached Muscat, the boat was hit by a storm and it sank, and they had to be rescued by a ship that happened to pass by. So when they arrived in Muscat, they were turned away by the Sultan of Muscat. From there, they proceeded to Dubai, and again, they were turned down. Finally, they arrived in Qatar and asked to be given an opportunity for employment with the oil company. But Sheikh Abdullah had to write to the British agent in Bahrain, who demanded that he must interview them first before they decide. So they were sent to Bahrain, and then the British authorities began they said there was no work for them, and the only way was to repatriate them back to Somalia. But then they were worried about the cost of sending back to Kosovo. So this is an oil company that was worried about repatriating 20 Somalians. So this actually sparked a flurry of exchange between British officials complaining about the presence of Somalis. And one British official wrote that this Somali business is likely to occur again and again. Could not political people warn of Somalis in Aden or Somalia or Somaliland to avoid further cases of stranding? And this continued. Then later on, the political agent in Bahrain complained that Somalis are notoriously troublemakers, and they had several altercations with the police. The same thing was voiced by British officials in Qatar, that in recent years the Somalis have increased. But he said, don't worry, our police could handle them quite easily. One interesting thing about those who were especially present in Qatar was that they were claiming that they came from British Somaliland. As many of you know, that Somalia was divided between Italian Somaliland, British Somaliland, and used the issue of British citizenship as an argument for seeking employment. So finally, the British official in Bahrain, they tried to gather some information. They came to the conclusion that they were incited by a man named Hassan bin Ali Somali, who was encouraging them to come. And the British agent told his officials that he wanted to have a word with him, and he met with Ali Somali, and he basically threatened him that if he kept doing that, he will be expelled from Bahrain. So these stories actually encapsulate a much complex history related to labor recruitment and the ideology that shaped the policies of labor recruitment by the British. So from the beginning, the oil concessions in the region stipulated that the British would have total control over who would work in the oil sector and how the workers were recruited. According to these arrangements, that preference will be given to locals, then they will be followed by Arabs from the region, as well as Indian who are considered as British subjects. So in the case of Qatar, in the late 1930s, of course, oil exploration began in the mid-1930s. So in the case of Qatar, they began to debate what kind of workers should be employed in the oil sector. So it's interesting that in the late 1930s, they began to throw these ideas. One of them was to give preference to Arabs, according to one British official who put it, well-qualified Arabs with the local experience were fitted by race, religion, and status to both work with their own hands and at the same time instruct and control raw and skilled labor. Ironically, also during that period, they even contemplated the idea of using Somalis, and the argument here that was made that Somalis will be suitable in view of their quote, religion, temperament, and capacity to work in the Arab desert, between quotes. And above, those already employed have been very satisfactory and have caused no trouble. But of course, all these ideas were thrown away because with the outbreak of World War II, oil operations were suspended and did not resume again until 1946, when the labor force began to be constituted again. So at that time, and here I would like to throw some examples. For instance, the oil company requested the political agent in Bahrain to approve the employment of Palestinians, technicians and so forth. Of course, every request has to be approved by the British Foreign Office. So the response was that as long as they are known to the company and have not engaged in political activities in Palestine and would refrain from doing so in Qatar, then they will be okay to be employed. Similarly, in 1949, they also requested the employment or the recruitment of Hungarians and Romanian technicians. And the response from the British Foreign Office, no way, because they could act as a propagandist or as active agents for communism. So these are the kind of thinking that informed the British. So if you could put the second slide. So the result of that, in 1951, if you look at the composition of the labor force, especially in the oil company in Qatar, you find that there were virtually no Somalis or people from the Horn of Africa and so on. So what these policies meant is that first they were shaped by issues of race, citizenship, and politics. What happened is that this resulted in the formation of a segmented labor force that was differentiated on the basis of pay, national background, and so forth. And this really sowed the seeds and had a great impact on working class solidarity, and sowed the seed for the labor protest, especially in the case of Qatari workers who were relegated to the lower rung and unskilled jobs in the labor market. And as a result of that, actually this paved the way for the massive labor strike in the early 1950s by Qatari workers, in which they demanded the expulsion and the improvement of foreign workers and their conditions. And finally, it also illustrates how the production of certain commodities have shaped not only labor relations, but social and political relations in the wider Indian Ocean. Because if you look at it, in the 19th century, when pearling was the main commodity, it was performed by free as well as slave labor. Fast forward, the oil industry also continued to use actually both free and unfree labor, because if you look at it until the 1950s, 1960s, the institution of slavery continued to exist even after. So you have this, the duality of this system that even though commodities change, but the system of labor has not changed. So I will stop here and give you some time for Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you to all of the panelists. We're already about 22 minutes over, so we'll just do a little bit of time for Q&A. I think I'll, yeah. I was going to do it at the end. Yeah, I was going to do it right at the end because I forgot at the beginning. So I'll do it right at the end. We'll save a minute for a tribute. The question, maybe I'll start just to kick off, is Amira's ability to, I think, go into court records, right? I think there's something that maybe we should speak about, the way in which that type of scholarly work is actually very, very difficult. And she was really a pioneer, as you said, Dr. Nelly, in the beginning, in terms of just bringing the court records to life, the way she was reading the court records, but the fact that she was reading Egyptian court records, she was reading Jordanian court records, she was reading court records from Palestine. So as a scholar, how rare is it, one, to be able to navigate such different court records from different countries in different time periods? I don't know if any of you guys worked with her on some of that research, but maybe if you could say kind of where she stands just in terms of the field with regards to that research.
Of comparative sources, I don't think many people do this, unfortunately. For example, in Egypt, we have very, very numerous court records, but they date from the late period, the 16th century onwards. And so it would be very useful for us to compare them to the court records of other parts of the Ottoman Empire. Unfortunately, those of Istanbul are in Turkish, and very few people work in both Turkish and Arabic. I mean, some people do, but they're very, very few in number. Unfortunately, also, even Arabic court records from other countries, there are very few people who have done comparisons. They exist. The access is perhaps not equal everywhere. Some parts of the Arab world it is difficult, some parts of the Arab world it is less difficult, but comparison has not yet developed.
Yeah,
So her work is unusual.
Yeah, I want to emphasize the bureaucratic hurdles. So I did some archival research for my very first book. I wanted to get access to some of the archival libraries in Istanbul, which should have been a pretty straightforward thing. But the bureaucratic red tape that one has to go through to get the permission, it takes up to 3 to 6 months sometimes, right? I was told that one of the best ways to do it is to just show up, drink coffee with the local functionaries of these libraries and archival centers, get to know them, and if they like you enough, they will expedite the process. Now, that's difficult for most of us to do anyway. Fortunately for me, I did get my research visa. You also have to apply for a special visa to be able to access these records. The process has been greatly streamlined since then. This was back in the late 90s, and a lot of these documents, fortunately, have been digitized. However, I have a feeling that court records have not actually reached that stage. Oftentimes, they're just fragments of original documents, right? So it's very hard to piece them together. She was, don't forget, Amira was also looking at financial transaction receipts and so forth. I don't think those are going to be digitized anytime soon. So the kind of legwork she did is absolutely pioneering, is absolutely innovative. It's not about to be superseded anytime soon. One tends to give up when one realizes the hurdles, but we all heard about Amira's spirit, her feistiness, and you give her a challenge, she's going to find a way to surmount that, right? I don't think a lot of people are quite capable of mounting that kind of exertion to get around some of these hurdles. So her research is going to remain exceptionally valuable for the foreseeable future and beyond. But I hope it sets an example for the younger generation scholars that it's worth their while to comb through these manuscripts, because if you're going to produce new knowledge, that's where we're going to find it.
And I would actually say, like within Islamic studies, because I come from the field of Islamic law, you have started to see a shift where more people are using court records now,
Yes.
which wasn't
Yes,
the
they are.
case 20, 30 years ago.
That's right.
There's also something that Amira used to say, and I think it's in one of her books, but I don't remember, where she says every statement of law behind it is also a juristic interpretation of a social fact. And if you as a scholar are just reading the law and you're not thinking about the social assumptions behind it, then you're missing something.
Yep.
So I think there was a way in which, even when she was reading texts, she was reading them differently. And then there was also all of the additional sources that she was bringing to the table. Yeah. Any questions from our audience about her work on legal history? Sorry, yes, in the middle.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentations. I have a question now. If we observe the region, at least in my mind, the rights of women here are inversely correlated to the interpretation of the law. For example, let's take Saudi Arabia. It used to have a very strict interpretation, minimal rights for women. The ruler changed, or at least the son of the ruler, now has a different interpretation, many more rights for women. They can drive a car, they can work, they contribute to the economy, as you very correctly said. Now we take another example, Afghanistan, extreme interpretation of the law, virtually minimal rights or zero rights for women. Now it looks to me Professor Sonbol was an open-minded person that made very compelling arguments in terms of benign interpretation of the law. She actually has evidence, as you said, from court cases where women's rights were protected. So the question is the following: how is it possible to apply this sort of interpretation, and instead of having the situation where whatever ruler or leadership comes in, suddenly they can overturn diametrically to 180 degrees the exact same law interpretation and make such a major difference in the rights of women in the region? Did she have any ideas of how to go about this? Because she was advocating, in my humble opinion, for the right way, but how can you ensure this, basically? How can you utilize her research to prove and apply this sort of an interpretation? Otherwise, it will always remain a theoretical exercise that can be arbitrarily cancelled. Thank you.
You're the legal expert, Sohaira. You should jump right into this.
I'll let you guys go. You guys are the speakers. Nelly, do you want to weigh in on this?
Yes, it's a complicated question. I'm not sure I quite understood exactly what you are wanting to say, but what I can tell you is this. When we use court records, there is a certain consistency time-wise, regardless of who is the ruler, because each judge or qadi is supposed to implement the law, the regulations or the provisions of his own mazhab, of his own school of law. Within that school of law, there are many possible interpretations, and so they're not always identical, the rulings that they make. But where does the political ruler come in? Well, the political ruler comes in occasionally, and he can overturn or judge or undertake a decision, but it is sporadic, and it is not. It is a one-time thing. It can be repeated, but there is a certain consistency in the way we see developments in the court records. I mean, they seem to follow a system, regardless of sporadic political decisions. I don't know if I answered your question, or if I understood. Did I answer your question?
Okay, it seems here in the region
But we cannot compare conditions in 20th century to conditions. There are too many differences in the structure of power. The structure of power is different. The extent of political power is different. The extent of religious power is different, and the way they combine is different. So I don't think it is valid to simply compare two incidents. One would have to go much deeper into the context of the time to understand how decisions are taken. Decisions are not taken in the same way or applied in the same way.
There's also a difference in the role that jurists play. Jurists had more autonomy in the pre-modern period, right? They often were not allied with rulers or with governments. You had state jurists, that's true. But because their source of income is usually independent of the state, they could also play a role as independent spokespersons. That's changed considerably in the post-colonial 20th century and current 21st century period. So I think we have to take Professor Hanna's caveat very seriously, that we cannot just compare across time and circumstance without considering the context. Most jurists today issuing legal edicts, fatwas, are often working for the government, right? You think about Al-Azhari jurists who are now spokespersons for the government. They face a lot of pressure to issue certain kinds of opinions that the government wants them to issue. So they don't have the same kind of independent juridical authority that many of them enjoyed in the pre-modern period when the circumstances were different and their sources of income were also independent of the state.
The only thing I would add to that is, you know, when Amira would critique the patriarchal state, she also wouldn't just exceptionalize the Middle East, right? So for her, the patriarchal state was nation states. And I think that was both in terms of who has the power to both create laws and who has the power to interpret laws. And I think you see this in America with Supreme Court decisions recently regarding women's rights and women's bodies. And so I think whenever you have the state having a monopoly over legal interpretation, and then you have a judiciary that is, again, state selected, depending on how that model works, then oftentimes it's women who face the brunt of that. So I think we can maybe sometimes see that a lot more clearly in the Middle East, often because we look for it more clearly here, but that doesn't mean these same problems don't exist elsewhere. I know we're running out of time. There is a tribute, so if there's no other questions, there is another academic panel. There's a tribute from Professor Patrick Laude, who is one of the founding faculty members of Georgetown Qatar as well. So we'll end with that.
Well, Amira Sonbol really deserved her first name, Amira. She was a leader, a generous leader, one who was always ready to serve and to help. And I'd like to emphasize the fact, first of all, that one way in which this generosity came out is through her service to the community, what she brought to this community of Qatar in the last 19 years. She was probably, among all the faculty at Georgetown University in Qatar, the one who contributed most to the development, the educational, cultural, intellectual development of the community. One of the ways in which she did that is by basically putting together a whole program in international relations at Qatar University that paralleled the program at Georgetown University. She basically put it together by herself. She served as director. She taught in it. She was a woman for all seasons, I would say, in it. And she helped tremendously a whole generation of young Qatari, and particularly young Qatari female, to develop, to unlock their intellectual and academic and human, indeed, capacities. So this is a tremendous contribution of Amira to the society. And I know how inspiring she has been for many, particularly for many Qatari female students in this respect. Now, another way in which the generosity of Amira came out was with a very different type of community, the community of dogs, and particularly the community of stray dogs. She had a big heart, and she really, really was extremely sad when she would see a stray dog on the roads of Qatar. And I remember this incident at an HR meeting in the early years of the program, when we were explaining how we would evacuate, how we would leave the country in case of emergency, and so forth. And Amira asked, and what about pets? And the response was not very conclusive. So she said, well, I'm sorry. If I cannot go with my dog, I'll stay here. And this was really Amira, a woman of passion and a woman of compassion. We miss you, Amira.
I had the honor of knowing Professor Amira since she arrived to Doha, Qatar in 2005. I assisted her with her housing, immigration, and any local needs. She treated me like her son, and I used to call her my mom. She encouraged me and inspired me to continue my education and professional development. Her contribution and passion for education to our community is a legacy and will remain in my heart.